What if I told you that somewhere in a small town in rural Montana, there lived a woman who claimed she could hear light itself dying? What if I told you that this wasn't just the ramblings of someone suffering from mental illness, but something far more disturbing? What if the sound she heard was real, and what it meant was something that would shake you to your very core? This is the story of Eleanor Whitmore, a woman whose extraordinary claim would lead to one of the most chilling discoveries in modern medical history. A woman who heard something that shouldn't exist, something that would ultimately reveal a truth so horrifying that the medical community tried to bury it for decades. In 1973, Eleanor Whitmore was 34 years old, living alone in the small town of Crow's Nest, Montana. She worked as a librarian at the local elementary school and was known throughout the community as quiet, reliable, and utterly unremarkable. She had never been married, had no children, and kept mostly to herself. By all accounts, Eleanor was the kind of person who would blend into any crowd, forgettable in the most ordinary way possible. But Eleanor harbored a secret that she had carried since childhood. Every evening, as the sun began to set, she would hear something that no one else could hear, a low, almost inaudible hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She described it as the sound of something vast and luminous, slowly losing its life, like the universe itself taking its last breath as a child. Eleanor had mentioned this sound to her parents, but they dismissed it as an overactive imagination. Teachers called it attention-seeking behavior. Doctors suggested it might be tinnitus or a mild auditory processing disorder, but Eleanor knew it was none of these things. The sound was too specific, too consistent, and too tied to the exact moment when daylight began to fade. For years, Eleanor learned to live with her secret. She would sit by her window each evening, listening to what she came to call the sound of dying light, wondering if she was the only person in the world who could hear it. She began keeping detailed journals, documenting the exact time the sound would begin, how long it would last, and any variations in its pitch or intensity. But something began to change in the autumn of 1972. The sound was getting louder, not dramatically louder, but noticeably so. Where once it had been a barely perceptible whisper at the edge of her consciousness, it was now becoming something that demanded attention. Eleanor found herself unable to concentrate on anything else during sunset hours. She would sit rigid in her chair, hands pressed against her ears. But the sound seemed to come from inside her head as much as from the world around her. By winter, the sound had become so intense that Eleanor was forced to leave work early each day, rushing home to prepare for what had become a nightly ordeal. She began stuffing cotton in her ears, playing loud music, even resorting to sleeping pills to knock herself unconscious before sunset. But nothing worked. The sound always found her. It was during this period that Eleanor made a disturbing discovery. She realized that the intensity of the sound corresponded directly to the length of the day. During the long summer evenings, when sunset stretched across hours, the sound would build slowly and steadily. But during the short winter days, when darkness fell quickly, the sound would hit her like a physical blow, sharp and merciless. More disturbing still, Eleanor began to notice that she could predict with uncanny accuracy the exact moment when the sun would disappear behind the horizon, even when she was indoors with no view of the sky. The sound would begin building approximately 17 minutes before actual sunset, reaching its crescendo at the precise moment when the last ray of light vanished from the sky. By spring of 1973, Eleanor's life had become completely consumed by her nightly torment. She had lost significant weight, her hair was falling out, and dark circles under her eyes made her look like she was aging and fast forward. Colleagues at the library began expressing concern, but Eleanor couldn't explain what was happening to her without sounding completely insane. That's when she made the decision that would change everything. Eleanor decided to document her experience with scientific precision. She purchased an expensive tape recorder and began recording during her episodes, hoping to capture some evidence of the sound that was destroying her life. Night after night, Eleanor would set up her equipment and endure the torment while the recorder captured everything. When she played back the tapes, she heard nothing but silence punctuated by her own gasping and whimpering. But Eleanor wasn't discouraged. If anything, this convinced her that whatever she was experiencing was beyond the range of normal recording equipment. She began experimenting with different types of recording devices, eventually borrowing sensitive acoustic equipment from the local university. Still, the tapes revealed nothing. But Eleanor noticed something else in the recordings, something that would prove to be the key to unraveling the entire mystery. In the background of every recording, barely audible beneath her own sounds of distress, was a rhythmic pattern. It wasn't the humming sound she heard, but something else entirely. A soft, wet sound that occurred at regular intervals. It took Eleanor weeks of analysis before she realized what she was hearing. It was the sound of her own heartbeat. But there was something wrong with it. The rhythm was irregular in a very specific way. During the times when the humming sound was at its most intense, her heartbeat would accelerate dramatically, then suddenly slow, then accelerate again. But it wasn't random. The pattern repeated with mathematical precision, like a code embedded in her own cardiovascular system. Eleanor took her recordings to Dr. Marcus Fieldman, a cardiologist in the nearest large city. Dr. Fieldman was initially skeptical, but when he analyzed Eleanor's heart rhythms during her episodes, he became deeply concerned. The patterns indicated severe cardiac distress, but Eleanor showed no other symptoms of heart disease. Her EKGs, during normal daytime hours, were completely normal. Intrigued, Dr. Fieldman agreed to monitor Eleanor during one of her episodes. What he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his career. As the sun began to set, and Eleanor began experiencing her nightly torment, Dr. Fieldman watched in horror as her vital signs transformed before his eyes. Her heart rate spiked to dangerous levels, her blood pressure plummeted, and most disturbing of all, her brain activity showed patterns consistent with someone experiencing severe pain. But it was what happened next that convinced Dr. Fieldman that Eleanor's condition was far more serious than anyone had imagined. As Eleanor writhed in apparent agony, claiming the sound was reaching unbearable levels, Dr. Fieldman noticed something impossible. Eleanor's pupils were dilating and contracting in perfect synchronization with the setting sun. Somehow, her nervous system was responding to changes in light that were occurring outside. Despite the fact that she was in a windowless medical examination room. More tests followed. Dr. Fieldman discovered that Eleanor's brain was producing unusual electrical activity in regions associated with sensory processing. But the patterns were unlike anything in medical literature. It was as if her brain had developed entirely new neural pathways designed to process a type of sensory input that shouldn't exist. But the most chilling discovery came when Dr. Fieldman decided to test Eleanor's claims about predicting sunset. He brought her to his laboratory at different times of day, never telling her what time it was or how long she had been there. Without fail, Eleanor would begin showing signs of distress exactly 17 minutes before sunset, even when she had no possible way of knowing what time it was. Dr. Fieldman began to suspect that Eleanor wasn't just experiencing a bizarre neurological condition. Something about her brain had been fundamentally altered, allowing her to perceive aspects of reality that remained hidden to everyone else. That's when Dr. Fieldman made the decision to involve other specialists. Over the next 6 months, Eleanor underwent extensive testing with neurologists, psychiatrists, and even physicists. The results painted a picture so disturbing that most of the medical team refused to believe their own findings. Eleanor's brain scans revealed the presence of unknown neural structures in her temporal and occipital lobes. These structures appeared to be organic, but they were unlike any known brain tissue. They seemed to be highly sensitive to electromagnetic radiation in frequencies that corresponded to visible light, particularly in the red spectrum that dominated sunset. But more disturbing than the physical anomalies was what the team discovered about Eleanor's past. When they delved into her medical history, they found records of a childhood accident that had never been properly documented. At age 7, Eleanor had been struck by lightning during a summer storm. The lightning strike had occurred at sunset. Eleanor had been found unconscious in her family's backyard, with severe burns covering the left side of her head. She had remained in a coma for 3 weeks. When she finally awakened, her parents were so relieved that they hadn't pursued extensive neurological testing. Eleanor seemed fine, perhaps a little quieter than before, but otherwise normal. What they didn't know was that the lightning had fundamentally rewired Eleanor's brain in ways that wouldn't become apparent for decades. Dr. Fieldman's team theorized that the massive electrical surge had created entirely new neural pathways in Eleanor's brain, pathways that had slowly developed and strengthened. Over the years, these pathways had somehow become attuned to the electromagnetic spectrum of light, allowing Eleanor to literally hear the process of photons dying as they disappeared from the sky. But if this theory was correct, it raised a terrifying question. If Eleanor could hear the death of light, what else might she be perceiving that others couldn't? The answer to that question would come in the most horrifying way possible. As autumn approached and the days grew shorter, Eleanor's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. The nightly episodes were becoming longer and more intense. But more troubling still, she began reporting that she could hear the sound during daylight hours as well. At first, it was just a faint whisper in the background of her consciousness. But, as the weeks passed, the daytime episodes grew stronger. Eleanor claimed she could hear the sound of light dying from artificial sources as well. Fluorescent bulbs, incandescent lights, even the screens of televisions and computers all produced their own versions of the deadly hum. By November, Eleanor was essentially trapped in her own home, unable to function in a world filled with the constant sound of dying light. She covered all her windows with thick black curtains and removed every light bulb from her house. She lived in complete darkness. But even this provided only partial relief, because Eleanor began to realize that the sound wasn't just coming from external sources of light. It was coming from inside her own body. The human body produces its own form of bioluminescence, a faint light created by chemical reactions within cells. Eleanor had become sensitive enough to hear even this microscopic death of light occurring within her own tissues. She was literally hearing her own cells dying, moment by moment. In an endless symphony of biological decay, Dr. Fieldman and his team tried everything they could think of to help Eleanor. They attempted surgery to remove the anomalous brain tissue, but the structures were so integrated with essential brain functions that any attempt to remove them would have been fatal. They tried various medications to suppress the abnormal neural activity, but nothing had any effect. Eleanor was trapped in a reality where she could perceive death itself at the most fundamental level. On December 25th, the winter solstice, Eleanor Whitmore made a final entry in her journal. She wrote that the sound had become unbearable, a constant shriek of dying light that drowned out all other thoughts and sensations. She could no longer eat, sleep, or even think clearly. The sound had taken over her entire existence. But in her final entry, Eleanor wrote something that would chill Dr. Fieldman to his core when he read it weeks later. She wrote that she had finally understood what the sound was trying to tell her. It wasn't just the sound of light dying, it was the sound of the universe itself slowly burning out, star by star, photon by photon. She was hearing the cosmic death that awaits everything in existence. The inevitable heat death of the universe played out in real time, through the death of every particle of light. Eleanor Whitmore was found dead in her home on December 22, 1973. She had died during sunset, her body positioned by the window as if she had been trying to look outside despite the heavy curtains. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. But Dr. Fieldman knew the truth. Eleanor had died from the sound of dying light. But Eleanor's death was not the end of the story. Dr. Fieldman continued his research. Driven by a terrible curiosity about what Eleanor had experienced, he began looking for other cases of people who claimed to hear sounds that shouldn't exist, particularly sounds related to light or electromagnetic phenomena. What he found was a pattern that stretched back centuries. Reports of people who claimed to hear the sun setting, who could predict solar eclipses by the sounds they made, who became physically ill in the presence of artificial light. Most of these cases had been dismissed as mental illness or fraud, but Dr. Fieldman began to see them in a new light. He theorized that Eleanor's condition, while triggered by the lightning strike, might represent an evolutionary mutation, a development in human neurology that allowed perception of aspects of reality that had previously been invisible. If this was true, Eleanor might not have been sick at all. She might have been the first member of a new form of human consciousness. But Dr. Fieldman's research came to an abrupt end when he made a disturbing discovery about himself. After months of working closely with Eleanor, studying her brain patterns and listening to her descriptions of the sound, Dr. Fieldman began to notice something changing in his own perception. On quiet evenings, when the sun was setting and the world was still, Dr. Fieldman began to hear a faint humming at the edge of his consciousness. It was barely audible, barely noticeable, but it was there. Dr. Fieldman never published his research on Eleanor Whitmore. Her case files were sealed and hidden in the basement archives of the medical center where he worked. Dr. Fieldman left medicine entirely, moving to a remote cabin in Alaska where the sun doesn't set for months at a time during summer. But even there, even during the endless daylight of the Arctic summer, Dr. Fieldman claims he can still hear it sometimes. The sound of dying light, growing louder each year. Just as Eleanor had warned, the question that haunts Dr. Fieldman, and should haunt all of us, is simple. If Eleanor could hear the death of light itself, what other aspects of reality are we missing? What other fundamental truths about existence remain hidden from our limited senses? And perhaps, most terrifying of all, if Eleanor was right about what she was hearing, if she truly was perceiving the slow death of the universe itself, then every sunset brings us one step closer to the moment when the last light in existence will finally fade away and the universe will fall silent forever. The next time you watch the sun set, listen carefully. If you hear a faint humming at the edge of consciousness, remember Eleanor Whitmore. Remember that some knowledge comes with a price too terrible to pay. And remember that in a universe filled with dying light, we are all eventually destined to join that cosmic symphony of ending. The story of Eleanor Whitmore raises questions about the nature of perception, reality, and the limits of human consciousness. Was she truly hearing something that others couldn't? Or was her condition simply a tragic case of neurological damage manifesting as auditory hallucinations? The truth may be unknowable, but the implications of her story continue to resonate. In a world where we're constantly discovering new aspects of reality that were previously invisible to us, Eleanor's tale serves as a reminder that there may be fundamental truths about existence that remain hidden, just beyond the reach of our senses. Whether Eleanor Whitmore was gifted with extraordinary perception or cursed with an impossible burden, her story stands as a testament to the fragility of human consciousness and the terrifying possibility that reality might be far stranger and more terrible than we could ever imagine. The sound of dying light continues to echo through the years. Since Eleanor's death, a reminder that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve, and some truths are too terrible to bear.